Welcome to Top of the Line. This is the podcast version of our YouTube show. New episodes every Monday and Friday where we talk about audio and hi-fi related themes.
If you have any requests for a future episode, send us an email, totl@abyssheadphones.com.
Well, hi again. We're back with another question off the internet this time. This one reads, "Hi fellas, big fan of your show. I myself am also saving up to hopefully own a pair of Abyss headphones someday. My question is this. Why do I constantly hear people saying that most planar headphones don't play well with tube amplifiers? What exactly is going on here? Thank you for your time, and I wish you all the very best going into the future. Best regards, Daryl." So yeah, that is a thing. You do hear that. And that seems to be more prevalent in the lower end of tube amps.
Little tubes?
Right. There's a few factors there.
Like these?
Oh, little tubes like
we got a lot of
those.
little tubes over here.
Yeah.
And I guess we should probably cover the basis. So first of all, there's multiple kinds of tube amplifiers.
We got to put numbers on this.
Some tube amplifiers, as in headphone amplifiers that have tubes in them, the tubes don't actually amplify directly to the headphone. They're not actually driving the headphone directly. They're just somewhere in there doing some degree of amplification.
Hybrid.
Typically called a hybrid approach. And there are also other amplifiers that use the tube to directly drive the headphone rather than like a solid state output with the tube just actually hidden. So the solid state hybrid output ones, you could see a tube in them, but those typically have no issues whatsoever driving any headphone as long as the output device in there is capable of driving it, of course, because they're basically a solid-state amp.
Well, that's typically why they make a hybrid, is because the solid-state devices tend to be better with power than...
Right.
You don't need the big tubes with a solid-state device, so it's less expensive to build, too, obviously, than because of the cost of the big tubes.
And smaller and more efficient.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you see them usually in the lower cost of tube amps because it just makes sense. It's easier to make, it's cheaper and kind of easier to make a solid state headphone amplifier than it is to make a tube one if you want it to be able to drive demanding loads.
It's kind of like the best of both worlds. You take a hybrid, you've got a tube buffer stage and input stage, which gives you that harmonic richness and, the tubey goodness of things and of music. And
Tubey goodness.
Yeah.
Flavor.
The flavor, yeah.
That's kind of how you look at it.
And then you've got your solid state with the raw grunt and power and ability to drive low impedance loads and have a low output impedance to keep control over the drivers or the speakers. So yeah, it's kind of the best of both worlds. I've seen some guys like Rogue Audio. They do that. They do a lot now with they do the hybrids in their integrated amps for speakers, and they're getting like 100 or 200 watts out of these. They're Class D output, so you get a ton of power, desktop integrated for relatively inexpensive, and they're running tubes for the input to give it that sound and some sort of novel feedback method to. The tubes are helping the Class D stage sound more analog because Class D sometimes could be a bit harsh sounding. Anyway, they got a good topology, and there's other companies doing that too, where they're mixing and matching the best of both worlds. And, Class D outputs, Class D power amplifiers can sometimes do a pretty good job, particularly with low impedance loads. They're pretty good at throwing current out quickly.
Well, solid state output is becoming more common now in tube amplifiers. So that is certainly something to bring up because you could certainly have a tube amplifier that has absolutely no problem driving any load, irrespective of the actual tube. However, if you have an actual tube amplifier where the tube is actually the amplification directly driving, or even through a transformer, if it's directly driving the headphone, that's a bit of a different thing. Because tubes typically are more voltage devices.
High voltage.
Yeah, rather than what you get with a transistor, you could design a solid state amplifier to pretty much drive any power, any load, any impedance.
Well, I think it comes down to, in most hybrid designs, you allow the components to play to their strengths, right?
Right, that makes sense.
I think that's what you were getting at.
That's what I was getting at here. So yeah.
The thing with tube amplifiers is because they run on a high voltage, there obviously needs to be some way of, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds of volts on their plate. There needs some way to isolate that high voltage from what you're powering or the load. You can't throw 400, 500 volts on a speaker. All right, so some of them use capacitors to couple that. Some of them use output transformers to isolate the voltage.
One of the biggest challenges with tube amplifiers is typically they're not particularly well suited for low impedance loads. They're more of a high voltage device. They work best at high impedance or low power. When you plug in something like a low impedance, low sensitivity headphone, it forces them to be in a low impedance, lower voltage region where they're not particularly good at producing power.
It can be made to be good, but you need a lot more
lot of tubes.
And usually in parallel, like when you see like larger speaker amps that are tube based, you're talking like you go up above 100 watts in tube power. It's a lot of power for speakers, which I mean, in a headphone world, that's about 20 watts or so for headphones if you divide by about 5 or 6. So a 15 to 20 watt capable tube amp in headphone world at 50 ohms, which would be a lot of power, right? Way beyond what you need. It's probably equivalent to about a 100 watt speaker amp tubes.
Yeah.
And you're talking usually at that point, you're at 4 to 6 tubes,
Well,
per channel.
Or 2 really big tubes.
Yeah, right. Some real large, really big tubes.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, bottom line is it gets more complicated to make a bigger tube amplifier than it does a solid
And more
state.
costly, too, because you need more tubes.
And you got to buy those tubes, especially if you want good tubes.
high
And then you need
power
to match them all, too.
Yeah.
high power tubes with headphones pretty much means you're making a really beefy amp just to drive your headphone. So it's not that it's not possible, it's just expensive. So you don't really see it done well until you get into the high end, and then there's plenty of those that are actually really quite exceptional. So tube amplifiers can be great, direct driving planar magnetic headphones, even low sensitivity stuff, but
You need
typically
power tubes.
they're expensive.
You have to have power
They're
output
beefy.
tubes. And the way to tell, like just looking at a tube amp, if it's beefy enough is, if you've got like one of these guys, if the amp is just full of these small, like a 12AU7 style or 12AX7 styles where the tube's like, what is this, about 2.5, 3 inches high. Can't get it out. If you got a bunch of these, which are really just driver tubes, or you would use these in low line level devices like we use these, these are in our compressor and our mic amps here. They're made for very low power. When you see an amp full of these smaller tubes, it's not a high power amp. I mean, it's probably made to put out, less than a watt,
Right.
if that. And when you start getting into the multi-watt tube amplifiers, now they use these to drive
Big tubes.
big tubes that are 6 inches tall. So when you see those size tubes on an amplifier, you got some,
a bit more
you got some
serious.
grunt there.
Yeah.
Versus this is made for smaller. A smaller amp will be designed using smaller tubes. Will be designed for much more efficient headphones. And a lot of people make smaller amps like that. You can get
Right.
an amp with one tube in it, that'll cover both channels, and it works. But it's probably only going to put out 100 milliwatts or something like that.
Well, I think the thing is, there's another thing here is the tube amps, as they get more powerful, they usually get bigger, obviously, because you get bigger tubes, more tubes and everything, whereas solid state doesn't necessarily have to get that much bigger to produce more power. It can be more compact.
With
it's
solid
more efficient,
state,
right.
heat
that's
and
the big
everything.
benefit. You could get devices, solid state output devices, that'll drive pretty much any headphone in pretty much any size. You can make an extremely powerful headphone amplifier that's small if you want to use solid state. So the size, the price doesn't necessarily correlate as strongly to the power, because they can be very inexpensive as well. Tubes, unfortunately, there's just not as much of a selection to play with. There's not really a great way to drive low impedance, low sensitivity headphones with a small compact tube amplifier. So you only really see it in the high-end boutique stuff.
And tube amps too, the power supplies are more complicated because you've got to have a high voltage power supply and a low voltage power supply to handle the thing, so usually you have usually have multiple input transformers. One run to high voltage and run to low, assuming you need a low.
Well,
a full tube amp might get away with it, but you do need 12 volts or so to run the heaters in the tubes.
Yeah, again, making it bigger, heavier, and more expensive.
Yeah, right. So
Right.
they are much more complicated, which is why they are more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Versus you can get a $100 solid state amp that's $100.
Plenty of power, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful,
Yeah, power is very inexpensive in solid state, and tubes, usually not.
But of course, the sound quality is completely different too. You compare to a cheap amp, $100 amp or so, to a nice tube amp, and it's night and day. They're totally different sound characters. You know, the $100 solid state's going to sound uppity and kind of lean and bright because it's probably running a wall wart power supply or something. And,
Well, yeah.
you know, it doesn't have a real power supply, you know, to back it. And where the tube amps kind of inherently got that going for it right away. So there's differences.
There's certainly pros and cons to both sides, but the biggest limitation is typically output impedance of the amplifier. And with a solid state design, you could get extremely low output impedance, and most planar magnetic headphones prefer lower output impedance. It helps control the diaphragm better. It helps start and stop the diaphragm faster. Usually improves your bass response mostly.
Yeah, and our headphones, that's pretty noticeable.
Yeah.
I mean, you really notice the grip. I'd call it grip. The grip the amplifier has on the driver. You know.
Yeah, there's, you know, every once in a while you hear an amp that's like, wow, in that respect, you know.
It's just tight.
Yeah, everything just feels solid.
Yeah.
It usually gives you a powerful sound.
It hits hard when it hits.
And the power might not even be that high. That's the thing. Might not actually be a lot of watts, in other words.
Yeah, you could have a low power amp with a low output impedance, and it could sound powerful.
Yeah, right.
They're kind of disconnected. A lot of times they go together, but they don't have to.
Well, bass is the foundation of music.
Yeah,
that it is.
Without it, it sounds lean. It sounds like it's far away.
Foundationless?
Yeah, it sounds
Yes,
foundationless.
foundationless.
It's like floating in the air.
Oh.
Yeah, it's not real. It's imaginary.
Imaginary.
Is anything
music?
real?
Yeah.
Is anything real? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I hope we answered the question well for
Maybe.
the gentleman. Yeah.
It's unfortunately kind of complicated.
Yeah. When you hear both,
There's a lot of factors.
when you hear all these various samples, we've listened to hundreds of things over the years. You get a real good feel for how, you know, these things fit into certain categories. You know, in terms of size, power, the way they sound sonically, low level playing, high level, different genres of music.
Well, there's one thing
You know.
we didn't touch on. Looks. Some people just want to
Yeah.
see a tube amp in front of them.
Well, that's
or
true.
some people don't.
Some
I don't
don't.
want any tubes.
Yeah, right.
So
Right.
that's a whole different thing.
Yeah. In fact, you come in looking at it, your vision gives you preconceived notions right off the get go.
Oh, it certainly
When you
does,
walk
yeah.
into a room and see that.
Yep.
We've had guys walk in our room running speakers, and we had tube amps, and people are like, I don't even want to hear this. I mean, they could sound wonderful with the speakers, but they don't want to hear it because there's tubes in the room, which is kind of silly because it's like you're lacking that experience and knowledge of what the system's capable of or not capable of.
Well, on a similar yet different note, I remember we went into that one Pass Labs room and they had their like 70-watt Class A monoblocks.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a tube kind of problem, even though they were solid state, because the room was real hot. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
It was like 85
Yeah,
in
right.
there. It's like, it's uncomfortable in here.
Must have been Denver.
Yeah, it was Denver.
Yeah. Sometimes the AC, the problem with running AC in
It's
the rooms
loud.
is it's loud.
Yeah.
So you keep it low level, but you get 20, 30
Yeah,
people
that
in a
was the
room.
problem they had.
And the
Yeah,
amps
they're
are running on 130 degree Fahrenheit.
Yeah, it was hot.
It's just like a space heater in the front of the room. So,
Yeah, they didn't want to run the AC. That's what it was.
That's always an issue.
Yeah.
We've played with that back and forth
Yeah.
in shows where
Opening the
when there
door.
ain't too many people in a room, we'll crank the AC. And then when people load in, we turn it down so people can actually hear the music. It's this constant fight with when you have hot amplification, hot electronics.
Well, especially when you have like 8
with,
amps.
with a lot of people in a room.
and that.
Yeah.
But it helps that it's, in the fall, so we crack the door open and then it's quiet.
Yeah, nothing like a sliding glass door on
That's
the
right.
9th floor to get some air.
As long as it's cold outside.
Yeah, it was pretty
It's
cool.
usually
out.
cooler than
Yeah,
it is
it's
in.
cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's Denver.
So anyways, to summarize, usually it's just a factor of the practicalities, right? You don't see inexpensive tube amplifiers that are capable of driving planar magnetic headphones because it's not practical. It's not that it can't be done. There's limitations, and solid state is usually better suited for that. But in the high end, you could do almost anything you want, and there's wonderful tube amplifier options, and they drive demanding planars great.
Yeah,
In fact, the WA33 is one of our most highly recommended amplifiers.
it's a great amp.
Yeah, you could watch our amp tier list video where we kind of sort of talked about a few different amps, and
In fact, we got a few
it got highly rated.
last 2 weeks. I think we have 2 new customers that ordered the JPS edition of that amp.
Mm-hmm.
So they're looking forward to getting them. Takes a few weeks to build them.
It's a nice amp.
That's
Does a
beautiful
great
amp.
job. Yeah, and the reason why is because it's super powerful, and with tubes, that's kind of a thing. You kind of need to make a really overkill amp to have it drive a low impedance load very well.
well, I think at least with the WA33 in particular, it's almost too powerful. You're like always at like 10 o'clock max.
I don't know. I vary it like I just vary the input volume. Like I don't run full out of the DAC.
Yeah.
I'll run into it at like minus 8 dB or something. I actually think it sounds better that way. So my volume's usually around noon.
Yeah, I guess you've used it more than me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I
every
vary
time
the
I
volume.
used it, it's like,
But if you just come
man, what
line
do you
out,
need all this extra power for?
yeah, if you come line out of a DAC at full volume or something, especially some of the DACs are hotter than 2 volts or so. You know, you don't need. You're right. There isn't much, but there is that gain switch. You
That's
can play
true.
with, too.
That's true.
Yeah, lower gain too. But yeah, I prefer high gain setting anyway. Low impedance, high gain, and drop the DAC input down a little bit to about -8, and that bad boy's got all kinds of volume range. Sometimes when I'm being exuberant, like cranking some AC/DC on the YouTube channel, they're watching the concert. I might be at 2 o'clock on the dial.
Oh, yeah?
With a
2 o'clock,
1266.
I don't think I've ever been past 12 o'clock on
That sounds kind of hot.
Well, it's
yeah.
YouTube, so the volume levels vary.
Oh.
It's live.
Ah.
Yeah. So you never know what you're getting there. It's not, it's not like a studio recording where they're running like minus 0.2 dB, They're just about there. So anyway.
Well, hopefully that vaguely summarizes it and gives someone an impression of why you just don't see these things quite so often.
Yeah.
But if anyone out there has any other questions, do you know what they can do with them?
They can email us.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
TOTL?
TOTL. At abyssheadphones.com.
Ooh. GOTL, that's how those
Capital
are
T, capital O, capital
All
T,
right.
capital
Well, maybe they'll do that.
top of the line. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves.